We always say that the old days were the best, but maybe it wasn't so. One incident that describes this was the Great Depression, a season marked by financial hardships and widespread unemployment. Families coped with limited resources in a whole number of ways, and one was through creative and resourceful cooking. Let's have a look at dinners that got us through the Great Depression. Potato soup with onions. Potatoes were quite popular and affordable while being easy to store. Families didn't have to worry about buying them in bulk. You'd start by peeling and chopping potatoes into small chunks and adding them to a pot of water. They'd be boiled until soft, allowing them to break down and thicken the water into a creamy base. If an onion was available, you'd add that next. They were sliced thin and sautéed in a little fat or oil. That brought out sweetness and depth, and with a splash of milk or a sprinkle of salt and pepper, you'd have a more elevated taste than usual. Rice and beans. If you think rice is common now, you have to look at the Great Depression. It was inexpensive and readily available in large quantities, making it perfect for families trying to stretch a budget. Beans were a dose of protein that the family got since meat was scarce and expensive, and preparing the dish was quite simple. You simply cooked the rice in a large batch and let the beans soak so that they were always perfect. In addition, you could throw in any scraps you had on hand to make it appeal more to children. Cornbread with milk or molasses. This was common in rural areas where cornmeal was affordable and often readily available. Made by mixing cornmeal with water, you could add a small amount of milk and egg if it was available. This would be baked in a pan over a wood stove or oven. It was different from the normal bread that required many more ingredients to make. Cornbread had the dense texture that was both filling and satisfying, and once prepared, it could be eaten in various ways. One common method was to crumble it into a bowl of milk. You'd get the perfect creamy meal with a mildly sweet flavor. During the Great Depression, milk was scarce, so families used cornbread with molasses. Molasses was inexpensive but still gave it a rich and caramel-like flavor that complemented its taste. Boiled cabbage and potatoes. If you ever believed you couldn't make a full meal out of only 2 ingredients, you don't know boiled cabbage and potatoes. Another dish that became a Depression-era favorite because of how simple and affordable it was. It had a nourishing quality hard to ignore. Cabbage and potatoes were amongst the cheapest produce items. You could store them for long periods without risking spoilage. That made them the practical choice for families trying to make their food last as long as possible. You simply chop the potatoes into chunks and put them in a pot of boiling water until they were soft. You had to cut the cabbage into wedges and strips, and together the two would simmer until they were tender. The result was a warm and satisfying dish that filled up the entire family without draining the budget. Fried cornmeal mush. This was a meal that turned humble cornmeal into a versatile dish. Cornmeal was inexpensive, and people could get it in large quantities. First, you'd create a thick porridge by cooking cornmeal in boiling water or milk, stirring until it thickened into a dense and paste-like consistency. It would then be poured into a dish to cool and set, usually left overnight in the icebox or a cold part of the kitchen. You could then slice it into pieces and fry it in a skillet with a small amount of oil, butter, or lard if available. The outside of each slice would become golden and crisp, while the inside remained soft, and it was often eaten for breakfast with a drizzle of syrup or a sprinkle of sugar. Bread and gravy. One of the most affordable foods that could be bought and made in large quantities, families would prepare a simple gravy using flour, fat, and water. If fat wasn't available, oil was used, or even just brown flour. Once that flour had been cooked down, water or milk was added and stirred to thicken it into a smooth gravy. You might have even been fortunate enough to have meat drippings or a small amount of butter, which could be added for flavor but most people still survived off the plain method. Navy bean soup. This meal helped families keep up their nutritional needs in the midst of everything that was going on. People not only enjoyed it for the nutritional value, but also because it was affordable and available. Navy beans were an inexpensive protein source that could be bought in bulk. They could be stored for long periods, making it possible for families to stretch their supplies over a long period of time. To prepare the soup, the beans were soaked overnight to soften them up, reducing the cooking time and making them easier to digest. Beans were then boiled in a large pot of water until tender, and if a family had an extra ingredient, they might add chopped onions, carrots, and celery, or even a few scraps of meat. The beans were the core of the soup, providing a rich and earthy base that thickened as it cooked. Dandelion salad. This meal is another example of resourcefulness amongst those who lived in rural areas or had access to open land. Most people today see dandelions as weeds, but back then they were a nutritious green that grew wild and free, making them an ideal choice since vegetables were scarce and unaffordable. It wasn't hard to teach children how to identify them and which parts to use. They were washed thoroughly and then used as the base for a salad. Dandelion greens have a slightly bitter taste, often mixed with other foraged or garden ingredients like wild onions, radishes, and more. For dressings, families kept it simple, using a bit of vinegar, oil, or even bacon drippings. The vinegar helped to mellow out the bitterness of the greens, while the oil and drippings added a touch of richness. Occasionally, a hard-boiled egg or a bit of breadcrumbs would be added to make it more filling. Oatmeal with lard or butter. This was a simple but reliable breakfast that helped families to start their day with energy. Oatmeal was affordable and widely available, making it a staple in many homes. It could be bought in bulk and made it cost-effective for families trying to make ends meet. Oats were cooked in boiling water until softened into a thick porridge-like consistency, and if milk was available, it'd be added for creaminess, but even without it, it was nutritious, high fiber, and provided a steady source of energy. To make it more rich, people could add a small spoonful of lard or butter, and if anyone told you they were adding lard on oatmeal today, you may find it unusual. In the Great Depression, it was a valuable source of fat and calories. The addition of lard or butter gave oatmeal a smoother texture and a mild and savory flavor. Corn chowder. This was a practical meal that made the most out of a few key ingredients available during the time. Corn was affordable, stored well, and readily available in canned or fresh form, quite the popular ingredient. Corn chowder was often made by simmering corn kernels in water and milk, along with diced potatoes to add bulk and texture. Potatoes helped to thicken the chowder, and families who had access to onions and a bit of salt pork added that to the meal. All you had to do was saute the ingredients and add them to the chowder. Even a dash of milk or cream to make the broth more rich was considered a luxury, but it didn't last long. Tomato soup with milk. Tomatoes did not have as much use in family meals until the Great Depression. They were widely available and relatively inexpensive, making them an ingredient you were likely to find in a pantry. You would often simmer canned or fresh tomatoes with water to make a basic broth. Salt and a pinch of sugar could be added to balance the acidity, and if you had an onion or a clove of garlic, you'd add those to deepen the flavor. Once the tomatoes softened up, they'd be mashed and pureed to give the soup a smoother texture. If you had milk, a small amount could be added just before serving. Milk was a luxury in those days, and tomato soup with milk was often served with a slice of bread or a simple cracker, an experience that made families forget about what was going on for a moment. Egg drop soup. Another creative way to stretch ingredients and create a nutritious meal with minimal cost. Eggs were affordable, versatile, and packed with protein. making them a key ingredient in Depression-era kitchens. You'd start by boiling a pot of water, adding a bouillon cube, salt, or even vegetable scraps to create a light broth. If you had access to seasonings like onions or soy sauce, you could add those for a bit of flavor. Once the broth was simmering, an egg would be whisked in a bowl and poured into a thin stream into the hot liquid while stirring gently. As the egg hit the broth, it could cook almost instantly, forming delicate ribbons all throughout the soup. It was light but nourishing, warming the body while providing a satisfying meal without any fuss. Hot dog stew. Hot dogs were cheaper than most other meats and became a common way to add protein to meals on a budget. All you had to do was chop up the hot dogs, brown them in a pot, and then add them to a stew for additional flavor. Meat was expensive in those days, so it became a cheap alternative. Lack of availability of meat didn't mean that families couldn't enjoy the stew that still had protein. Some would serve it with bread and biscuits, and children would use the bread to soak up the broth before eating. Pasta with ketchup and tomato juice. During the Great Depression, pasta sauces were out of reach. Families had to find an alternative to what they could eat with their pasta, and when canned tomatoes or tomato sauce was unavailable, they turned to ketchup and tomato juice. Pasta was inexpensive and could be bought in bulk. After cooking it to perfection, it was drained and returned to the pot, and a small amount of ketchup or tomato juice was then added. You might think it didn't taste very well, but people loved it. The tomato juice offered a similar flavor as tomato sauce, but with a more thin consistency if it was available. Ketchup added a tangy sweetness that was a decent stand-in for traditional tomato sauce. Meatless meatloaf. One of the most creative ways to eat well during the Great Depression was meatless meatloaf. It was a loaf that was supposed to be made of meat, but was a creative twist on the traditional meatloaf. It was made to stretch small amounts of meat or replace it entirely when meat was scarce. This meatloaf was made using breadcrumbs, oats, and crushed crackers, binding the loaf together and adding bulk. Vegetables could then be finely chopped and mixed in for extra texture and nutrition, and when they were available, beans and lentils could also be put in, providing protein and a hearty feel. For flavor, families could add a spoonful of mustard or sauce, along with eggs and a bit of flour to hold everything together. After shaping it into a loaf, it was baked in the oven, developing a crusty exterior while staying soft inside. Families would brush the top with a bit of ketchup or tomato sauce, adding that tangy sweetness while making it feel like a real meatloaf. Peanut butter sandwiches. A simple yet essential meal, often served as breakfast, lunch, or a snack. You're familiar with this one because it's still common today. But there's a story you need to know about how it became widespread. Peanut butter was inexpensive during the Depression, while being widely available and packed full of protein and healthy fats, making it a valuable staple. For families with children, peanut butter sandwiches were a reliable way to provide energy and nutrients, and the sandwich itself was just peanut butter spread on slices of bread, which could be store-bought or homemade to save money. If a family had sugar or jelly, it could be added for extra sweetness, but plain peanut butter was nice enough. The creamy or crunchy peanut butter made the sandwich filling, with just one or two providing enough sustenance to hold somebody over till the next meal. These sandwiches were eaten with a glass of milk if available, or a piece of fruit on the side. Biscuits with milk gravy. This was another Depression-era classic made from a few inexpensive ingredients. Biscuits were quick to prepare and did not require yeast. They relied on baking powder as a leavening agent. Usually made with flour, baking powder, a bit of salt, and fat, they were mixed, shaped, and baked until golden brown. Milk gravy was made with a simple amount of flour and fat, which was then cooked in milk until thick and creamy. When meat drippings or bacon grease were available, they were added for extra flavor, but even without them, they were comforting and filling. The creamy, savory gravy would be poured over the hot biscuits in a way that made your stomach scream in joy. Biscuits and milk gravy made a comforting breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Cabbage and noodle casserole. Cabbage was a staple in many Depression-era households because it was affordable, available, and stayed fresh longer than most other vegetables. Combining it with noodles created a simple and filling casserole that could feed a family without a whole lot of cost. To make it, you'd slice the cabbage and saute it in some oil or butter, and to help soften the cabbage and bring it to its natural sweetness. Cooked noodles were then mixed with the cabbage in a baking dish, and if available, families could add onion, salt, and spices with a sprinkle of cheese or breadcrumbs. The casserole would be baked until the top was lightly browned, creating a warm and comforting dish that felt like a real treat. Bread pudding with old bread. If there was ever a time when food wastage wasn't tolerated, it was the height of the Great Depression. Bread pudding was a resourceful dish made specifically to avoid wasting any food, and when it started to go stale, families would save it rather than throw it away, transforming it into a pudding. Stale bread would be cubed and placed in a baking dish and then soaked in a mixture of milk, eggs, sugar, and sometimes vanilla or cinnamon. As the bread absorbed the liquid, it softened and transformed, creating a custardy, lightly sweetened pudding when baked. If fruit, nuts, and raisins were on hand, they could be added to enhance the texture. Bread pudding was baked until the top was golden and the inside was soft and creamy. It was often served warm with a drizzle of syrup or a bit of cream. A great way to give new life to bread that might otherwise have gone to waste. Potato pancakes. Potatoes were a staple food for many as they were cheap, filling, and could be stored for a long period of time without spoiling. As the main ingredient, potato pancakes became a reliable dish that could be served for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. To make them, you would grate the potatoes along with a small onion, and they were then mixed with a bit of flour to bind them together along with an egg, making the pancakes more cohesive and adding a bit of protein. Some recipes even called for spices, like salt and pepper, keeping the seasoning simple. Once mixed, the batter was shaped into a small patty and fried in some oil or fat, cooked until golden brown and crispy on the outside while remaining tender on the inside. Be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel so you never miss another great memory in the future, and stay updated with all of our latest content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.